Hey, Seminary Dropout listeners, this is Sean Palmer. I'm the teaching pastor at Ecclesia Houston in Houston, Texas. And Shane's given me a minute to share with you about how you can be a blessing to the kingdom in Houston. Because Seminary Dropout has a worldwide audience, those outside the U.S. may only have a passing awareness of the Category 4 hurricane that hit Texas this past week. Category 4 is almost as big as it gets. But this storm, Hurricane Harvey, was extremely slow moving. And because it was so slow, it dropped over 50 inches of rain on Houston and Southeast Texas, and all of this in just a few hours. The banks overflowed, nothing could handle it, everything flooded. That's what we call a 1,000-year flood. Over 33 people lost their lives. Families were rescued off roofs of their houses. Highways were transformed into rivers. It has been absolutely catastrophic, unworldly. Millions of people, including me, have had their homes flooded and are facing a long, daunting, wearying repair, and all of the insurance companies that come along with that kind of repair. You know all that if you're in the States and you've been following the news. You have also likely wondered about how you could respond. At Ecclesia, we have a couple of ways you can act. You can find all these online at ecclesiahouston.org/helphouston. Ecclesia is spelled ECCLESIA, ecclesiahouston.org/helphouston. First, you can donate. This is going to be a multi-billion-dollar repair. One of my friends in Dallas just made a decision, and he had his church, as an initial act, send a check for $50,000. This is a great opportunity for our mega churches to do something truly mega. You may not be able to do that. Maybe you can do $500 or $50 or $5. We just need some things that right now we can't afford to buy. So instead of handing out food, we're giving families gift cards, letting them use their agency. They know better what they need than we do. We're buying the tools that we need to do the repair, to do some of the demo and the reconstruction. We cannot at this moment house food or clothes, so we are not taking food or clothes, but we are cleaning up. And then in 6 or 8 or 10 weeks, when most of that is done, we'll move into the second phase. What you can do now as a second move and in the future is you can send a team. We want to invite you to bring a team of people to help clean up and do some work alongside Ecclesia. Ecclesia will give you a great breakfast, we'll organize you, we'll house you while you're there. You'll head back home when we're done, refreshed and reinvigorated. I promise you that. And all of this is available again at ecclesiahouston.org/helphouston. And church, I'm just asking you to dig deep. This is a chance for the church to be the church, and I know we can do it together. This is our chance to be a faithful witness to our communities, to rise above the left and the right politics, and this is who disagrees with this person, and this people are making this statement and that statement, and just be the church. In this darkness, we can shine together. So be blessed, my friends. Go to ecclesiahouston.org/helphouston and add your name to a list of heroes of the faith there who are doing everything they can to bring healing and hope. God bless you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to Seminary Dropout, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. In cooperation with MissioAlliance.org, straight from my house in Austin, Texas to yours, interviews with leading Christian authors, leaders, and thinkers, because good theology should be for everyone. This is Seminary Dropout. Let's go! My guest is Mandy Smith. Originally from Australia, Mandy is lead pastor of University Christian Church, a campus and neighborhood congregation with its own fair trade café in Cincinnati, Ohio. She contributes regularly to Christianity Today publications and the Missio Alliance blog, and she's the author of Making a Mess and Meeting God. Her latest book is The Vulnerable Pastor: How Human Limitations Empower Our Ministry. Mandy and her husband Jamie, a New Testament professor at Cincinnati Christian University, live with their 2 kids in a little house where the teapot is always warm. Mandy, thanks for being with me.
Oh, it's good to be with you.
In your bio, I mentioned, and people will gather from your accent, you are originally from Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious about your upbringing and what that was like.
Yeah, I grew up in Brisbane, which is the 3rd largest city in Australia, and grew up always attending church. It was a big part of our family's life. But at the same time, I don't know what the statistics are now, but Australia's never really had any kind of a revival or, it was founded as a penal colony, which, it's very different kind of founding from the religious freedom that you had in the background of this country. And so the church was a very small kind of factor in the culture there. And so I just grew up knowing, I think there were maybe 2 other people in my class at school, the whole grade level who would have been known to be Christians in some way. So it was a very different kind of place. And yet at the same time, I see how now in the 20 years or so that I've lived in the US is actually feeling more and more like that. To me, that's becoming more of a post-Christian context. And so there are ways that in some ways that feels more, I know how to deal with that. I don't know how to be in Christian empire, so to speak, so, but so that's one part of my growing up experience in Australia anyway.
Do you know who in your family first became Christians and how that became a part of your family?
Oh my goodness. I think it was just, as far as I know, everybody had passed it on through generations. And my father actually was a first generation Australian. His dad was from Ireland. His mum was from Russia. And even, tracing back across different places like that the story is a story of Christian faith. So no, I don't know.
I just find that so interesting in when people are Christians in a post-Christian context. That's always so fascinating. For me, growing up in the Bible Belt, it's kind of like, well, that's what everybody does,
Yeah. It really does kind of purify your faith, and it makes
I would imagine
choices more obvious than they might be in a place where everybody else is Christian, and you kind of just get used to being a bit strange. It's not. So, I think it did feel very strange when I first moved here, and I felt so surrounded by it. And at first it felt very comfortable, but after a while I got a little bit disturbed by it. And interestingly, my husband is a New Testament professor, and he and I both had opportunities to say, like, how Christians don't care about this stuff, and people at the time it was like, but we do, and so some of the things that we would just say that seem so obvious to us would actually get us in a bit of trouble when we first moved here. But I'm watching how in more recent times, Christians, those kinds of conversations are more and more common, and Christians are the ones who are actually starting them themselves. And so that's been interesting to watch that trend in the last 20 years or so.
That's so fascinating to me, because I think that Christians here in the U.S., we've had power for so long that we have a lot of trouble letting go of that. And whereas I find that Christians that I meet that grew up in a non-Christendom context, they never had that power anyway, and so it's very easy to let go of and to see yourselves as not getting your way in society all the time.
Right. And I remember the very first Sunday that I went to church here, actually, and they had an announcement saying, we are boycotting these 2 companies because they've been advertising on TV during a show that has sexuality in it or something like that. And I, coming from my context in Australia, I was like, well, good luck with that. Like 5 people boycotting, what difference is that going to make, and didn't realize at that point the kind of power that the Christian world has here politically and economically. And of course, their response was heard and felt by those companies. And at the same time, I also thought, like, why are we surprised? Why do we expect that a TV station is going to represent our values? Just don't watch it if you don't like the way that it's presenting things. So that was, I think, one moment that really felt like a collision of worldviews for me.
Oh, I'm curious how old you were when you came to the States.
I was 18. I was fresh out of high school. I was engaged to my boyfriend by the time before I was even graduated. And so he was coming over here to study. He's 5 years older than me. And He had got a scholarship to study the Bible over here, and I didn't want to be left out of that. So I graduated in December from high school. Our school year is different. I was married in April, and then July moved here and have been here pretty much ever since. So it was quite a year.
Oh my gosh.
I know. And now I have a daughter who's 18, so I'm realizing, oh my goodness.
Yeah, it seems a lot younger now, doesn't it?
Uh-huh. Oh, but I was, of course, a very mature 18-year-old.
Of course. Yeah, we all were. So the last book you wrote was called The Vulnerable Pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And that essentially was about allowing pastors to be humans as well. And I just wonder what from your journey in ministry led you down that path.
Yeah, wow. I tell the story in there of this kind of crisis moment where it all came to a head at a big Christian conference. And I think I've heard since that many people have crisis moments at Christian conferences. And I was stepping into a new leadership role at my church and just really open to the Lord's leading and preparation for that, and kind of went with an open heart, expecting that God would use that conference to prepare me. And he definitely did, but not in the way that I expected, because I just felt this collision with a model for ministry that I just could never be. And that was a true crisis for me. I don't think I put it into words until months afterwards, but I tried to stay in that conference through the day and just could not. There were so many subtle kind of indirect things, but also direct things that I just really did not see people who looked like me or talked like me or cared about the things I cared about. And I thought they were good people and they weren't doing anything to harm me purposefully, but finally just kind of escaped to my hotel room and holed up there for about 24 hours. And I think I was throwing up several times during that time. And, it was probably very dramatic. I think I threw myself across the bed and wept for hours on end and just told the Lord, you've made a mistake. I've got nothing. I don't see, if that's what it means to be a leader in the church, you've made a mistake, because I have none of that. And, at the time, it felt like a death. And when I remember that hotel room, it almost feels like a tomb to me. But in that place, the Lord just kept saying to me, in your weakness, I am strong. And it really didn't feel very comforting at the time, because I think I'd always understood that to mean, in your weakness, I will make you feel strong. And I wasn't feeling strong. And so the promise just didn't really ring true to me. But really, that book took me several years to figure it out. But that book is an exploration of how that could be true. I'm like testing that one short promise, in your weakness, I am strong. And I'm kind of like testing the boundaries of it and saying, well, if that's true, what does that mean for how I preach? What does that mean for how I rest? What does that mean for how I talk to other people? What does that mean for how I seek out other leaders and how I recognize the opportunities for leadership in other people? If that's really true, I'm going to test that out, because if it's true, it's got to be true for all of us. It's got to be true in everything. And so I can testify that it is absolutely true, and I'm still figuring out the depths of the truth of it. But the scary part is that we will most likely never feel strong. And this is why Paul boasts in his weakness. He doesn't say, so now I feel great and now I feel strong. His boldness is coming from his trust that if he lets his weakness and limitation be seen, that then God's strength can be obvious. And this is, the stories throughout all of Scripture, David and Goliath, all of these stories are a story where it makes no sense, because the human being couldn't possibly do it in their own strength. People look at David and say, oh, this makes no sense. There must be something else at work. And so for us to let God's power be seen, we have to let our own limitation be seen and move forward in spite of how much we feel inadequate and limited. And it's a miraculous thing, honestly, to behold, because it shows, even as you are the one stepping shakily into those promises, you get to stand back at the end as well and say, wow, something happened there that really I can even see was not me. So that's a very long way of answering your question, but that's how it all began for me.
I wonder if that's something that you have to train the people in your church to accept. In other words, if you have to train the people in your church to be pastored by a vulnerable pastor.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is hard to do when you also feel vulnerable.
Yeah.
And if people aren't safe, if, they can sometimes, thankfully, my congregation has been incredibly healthy and encouraging of me, because there were times where I didn't want to be doing this. I'd much rather put forward a very strong front and look like I've got it all together. And they have been the ones who have encouraged me. But I've also heard stories from other people in their congregations that have, kind of remembered, kept account, and used it against them. And so, as leaders, then it's a strange place for us to almost say, to, still develop them in that, even as we are figuring it out ourselves. But I have watched how in those moments when I've had conversations with folks in that situation, I think it's really enlightening, because when a congregation relies on the pastor to be strong, it may be a sign that they are actually putting their hope in that person and not in God. And there's a kind of idolatry there. And so as hard as it is for us to be the ones who say, hey, don't expect so much from me, how is this unhealthy for your own spiritual development? I think that's a part of our call to do that, as opposed to just saying, well, I need to just work harder to be this thing that they are expecting me to be. And so we have to trust that if God has called me as a human being to do this work, then there must be some way for me to do it. And that as I do it in that way, it must also be good for the human beings who I lead. And maybe our best calling is not to be God for them, but to be an example of what it looks like to follow God. And there's nothing better than our own weakness and limitation to teach us how much we need him, So it's a switching of mindsets for all of us. Yeah.
And I think a lot of us know of churches who, when the pastor has left, things have completely fallen apart because they were relying on that pastor to be strong for them. And also, I mean, I can remember my church past being part of other churches, and when pastors would leave, it was like, well, we're just in maintenance mode until we can get another pastor. Or, I mean, it's almost like we're living in Babylonian exile until we have another pastor,
Right.
And, I had this great experience where this summer, my pastor, John Chandler,
Yeah.
who went on sabbatical, and we just had this like beautiful summer, and he took this rest that he very much needed. And people jumped in, and we just had this beautiful summer together where we obviously missed our pastor, but things carried on and beautiful things happened.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned rest, because that's been one of the places that has taught me this more than anything. That, Sabbath is not really just about resting so we can work harder, but about remembering our identity. And I see in the stories in Exodus, God calls the people to celebrate Sabbath before he gives the 10 Commandments. And I think it's because he wants to break them out of the habit of being slaves. They've been slaves for 400 years. And now he wants to say, slaves don't get a break, but children do. And you'll take a break from whatever it is that feels productive. And it's going to be really hard because you love feeling productive. And rest in the possibility that I can handle the world for a day without you, that this is not all up to you, and that your identity is not based on what you accomplish, that I delight in you just because you exist. And that is really countercultural and has been really hard, but it has knock-on effects, and it lasts through the whole week. There's a beautiful part of the celebration that Jewish people use at the end of their Sabbath, where they pour wine into a vessel and pour it and pour it and pour it until it overflows out of the vessel. And it's their prayer as they're doing that the rest from that Sabbath would flow into the rest of their week. And so really so much of what I'm talking about with the vulnerable pastor is this lifestyle of Sabbath, even when we are busy, to trust that I'm still only bringing about, I think the other day I said it's about 18% is about a good percentage, I would say, of what I think I should have for any sermon, for any meeting that I have. As much as, I mean, this is not an excuse to just not do our best. I don't want anybody to hear me saying that. I work really hard and I read and I study and I reflect and I prepare, and I still feel like I'm bringing about 18% of what I think is needed for any given task. And so that's a kind of Sabbath too, of saying, I'm trusting that God is carrying this. This is ultimately his work. He has called me for some mysterious reason to be a part of it with him. And I will bring, it's the crumbs, it's the fish and the loaves. I will bring what I have and trust that he can multiply it into something else. And there's a strange kind of freedom in that. Like, I have learned to laugh at myself more than I ever have before. And there's this almost like, well, this is ridiculous. Like, there is no way I can do this. It's so ridiculous. It's funny. I just have to laugh, And so that's really been freeing and encouraging.
Well, let's talk about SheLeads for a little bit.
Yeah.
So this is, for those who don't know, SheLeads is a summit that Missio Alliance is putting on. I think last year was the first time that they had it. So this is the second year. And it's a summit about men and women together, checking out God's vision for shared leadership in the church and ministry. So I wonder if you could just put some flesh on that and talk a little bit more about the summit and what it's about.
Yeah, we're really excited. It's just a one-day event on October 28th. And there'll basically be 3 plenaries. It's Todd Hunter, Jean Birch, and Nancy Ortberg will be doing our plenaries. And then we'll also have a panel discussion. And all of this is happening live in Pasadena, but we'll be also live streaming it all over the country. There are currently 11 other venues that are hosting it all over the place. And I know you'll be having one there in Austin.
That's right.
And also anybody, anywhere, wherever they are, whether they want to go to a local venue, or they can also take part in it by live streaming it in their own home or with a small group or just by themselves. So people can take part in it any of those ways, whether coming to Pasadena in person, going to a local venue near them, or live streaming it online with a group or by themselves. And we can also, you'll also have access, if you register to live stream, you'll have access to the recordings afterwards. So that'll even be available if you can't make it on October 28th. And the broader vision of it, for me, it was happening before my role started this year. For me, I'm inspired by Edwin Friedman's approach to leadership, and also by Walter Brueggemann's prophetic imagination, both of which call us to set aside an anxious kind of presence and a power-driven kind of approach, and to have a kind of prophetic posture, which draws on imagination and draws us out of reptilian ways of just survival instincts. I think that when we talk about power and leadership and gender in the world, it's such an us and them, if you get more, I get less, scarcity kind of approach. And then when we want to flip that, we just keep the same hierarchies and say, well, now women get to be in charge. Now it's our right to have the role that men have had. And I don't think that's truly the gospel way. And so as much as it's taken healing in my own heart to get away, like I have quite a few good reasons to be angry or to be frustrated because of real experiences that I have had. And I dare say women who take part in SheLeads will have some of those similar stories. But at the same time, we have a bigger story and a better story, which tells us that we are called by our Father, and we are welcomed into his mission, and we are recipients of his grace. And if we let that story be our primary story, then we can extend a hospitable space even to those who may not see us as God sees us, and not only say to them, hey, God doesn't see me that way, but hey, God doesn't see you in that way either. And that takes a lot of work. But so I'm because God is doing that kind of healing in my own life in the last couple of years, and how I'm seeing it brings healing in my relationships with the men that I lead with. I just long for that kind of healing for all of us, to set aside the world's ways of talking about power and leadership and gender. And I think often when we have an imaginative approach that, is inspired by things like Ephesians 5, where we talk about, a metaphor of of a husband and wife is used in describing Christ's relationship with his church. And I actually think that we can even explore that in relationships between men and women in general in the church, that and I've watched this, as I have found healing with the men that I lead with, it has healed the work that we're doing, and in so doing healed our mission and healed the church. And so that's my longing for this day, that in some way women will be invited into a new imagination of what God is calling them to and how this might look, that men might be invited into a new imagination of what it looks like to encourage the women in their lives and churches, and that men and women together might be able to dream about how we can lead in a way that really sees one another as brother and sister in this family that we're a part of.
You know, one of the things that you alluded to there that I appreciate so much about SheLeads and about the way it was done last year, you know, so often what we do when we have noticed that we've done something wrong in Christianity is we find some kind of model from the greater culture and then kind of slap a Christian veneer on it. And so one of the things that you alluded to was often when we have these conversations about women in ministry or in the church, it's often kind of like, okay, men, you've been in charge long enough. Now we're going to flip that, and it's time for women to have a turn. And so if it's almost as if we want to exchange patriarchy for matriarchy, and what SheLeads is about is really saying, well, maybe that entire system is flawed. Maybe we don't need to just change places, but maybe we need to do away with those scales altogether.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was taking a breath because I love what you said.
So, you know, last year I mentioned that here in Austin last year we had it was just like a viewing party. But the church that I'm a part of here, Austin Mustard Seed, hosted it. It was kind of on the fly, and we had just about 20 people come, but it was so meaningful to see this group of people, mostly women, and be so affected by the words that they were hearing from the panelists, and be so, to steal Tara Beth Leach's title, to be so emboldened and empowered to lead. And it was just, I felt like it was a message that they very rarely heard. And I think that's so significant.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And as much as we don't like to dwell on the negative experiences that we've had, I think most women who are called to ministry in some way have had some very obvious and direct ways that they've been dismissed or maligned or just mistreated, and in some places I should say I have many friends who actually are not affirming of my role as the lead pastor, and because they are coming from a place of wanting to honor scripture, I actually really respect that. And in some ways, I have more respect for that than people who agree with me but who haven't actually wrestled with scripture and who just think it's the next cool thing to believe in. So I should say that I have, in my own wrestling, it's been always like, I only want to do what I see in scripture, and I don't want to do this just because it feels right, you know, and that has taken a lot of work. And so I admire the people who are doing that work, even if they don't come out in the same place. And those people are very respectful in the way that they speak to me. But there are some who somehow feel threatened and who don't really speak in Christian ways. And that's when I feel like there's another power at work that is not just, hey, sister, I'm calling you to repentance because I think you're working against the spirit in your life or something. I have space for that. But when there are ways that women have been spoken to or treated that really don't feel Christian, then that's really troubling. And so I think we need to have space to lament that, and space for women to share those stories, and at the same time not stay there, but share a better story. And I know that some of the ways that those things have happened to me, I almost feel like it shaped this kind of two-dimensional chalk drawing of myself in my own heart and spirit. And that I'm just an upstart, or that I am never going to be as good at this as a man, or, so many different things that I hadn't even named for myself, that just over time had come to be a part of how I saw myself. And I've had several moments where just in the middle of prayer, I felt like God has just like wiped clean that image and shown it to be this two-dimensional chalk sketch that felt so real to me, and replaced it instead with like a solid marble sculpture of something that is so much more beautiful of how he sees me. And once you catch a glimpse of that vision of how God sees you, then I don't know, you can filter those other things, you can heal from them in new ways. And I can't even remember now what you were talking about. But you were talking about the women. Oh, you were talking about the women who came last year, and the way that you saw something change in them. And I love Kurt Thompson is a Christian neurologist. I have to always pause between those, because if I ever mention him, people are like, he's a urologist. No, he's a neurologist, a Christian neurologist. And he talks about how story engages a whole person, engages the left part of our brain, which is logical and loves language. It engages the right part of our brain, which loves emotion and metaphor. And so and scripture does this all the time, but when we step outside of just argument and proof texting, and step into the vulnerable practice of sharing our own stories, then I think something new happens, and we are able to have empathy and have communion in a new way. And so that's a part, I think, of what's happening here. And there have been several moments, and I've heard other women say this too, where men have said to me, I actually, in theory, don't agree with what you do, but when I watch how you're doing it, when I hear your stories, I realized that I was kind of using the Bible to justify my own fears, but actually, when I see the way women can step into a Christ-like kind of leadership, I'm not troubled by that at all. In fact, I'm really encouraged by it. And so that helps me. For the first time when somebody said that to me, it helped me see how we are bringing the world's idea of what it looks like for a woman to lead into the church. And I think we've often thought, after the women's movement, which has won so many good things for women, but also has its own kind of baggage, we assume that for a woman to be strong and to be a leader, she has to be ambitious and domineering and, pushing her own way on other people. There's a stereotype of that. And of course, then it's natural to say, well, but that's not very Christian, so a woman can't be a leader in the church. And we're not as troubled by men who have those tendencies in the church, but for some reason we're very troubled by women who have those tendencies. And so if we believe falsely that that's the only way a woman can lead, then of course it's natural that a woman couldn't lead in the church, because those aren't Christian ways. So one of the challenges then is for women themselves to set aside those models and to set aside the emotional stuff that makes you want to fight for your rights, and actually let the story of Jesus be the main thing that we're moving through, moving with. We can expand our own imaginations out of that small two-dimensional caricature that the world has presented of women leaders. We can ourselves have a new imagination, and sometimes we are even, again, to quote Tara Beth Leach, she says we become our own role models because we may not have seen anybody do it like we have to do it before. And then we test, like, can a woman do this? Let's find out. Okay, I guess she can, every single time. And so as we ourselves are stretching our own imaginations of what it looks like to live out the calling God has put on our lives, we are also stretching other people's imaginations, the young women who are watching us and the men who are in our lives. And so it is a bit of an experiment, and it's a little bit scary, but with God's grace, I am watching new things unfold. And like you said, I'm hungry for that moment, or those moments on the day in October when I see women's faces light up and when I see their eyes glisten in a new way as they catch some vision of what God has for them. And I long for that for the men who come as well. I'm assuming they'll be in the minority, but we absolutely want men to be a part of it. And I long for them to set aside the pain that this has been for them too. I'm sure men each bring their own pain associated with conversations and relationships that they've had with mothers or sisters or wives, and to find healing from that would be beautiful as well.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think that, just the nature of it, the majority there will be women, but this is not a women's conference in that only women are supposed to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is so valuable for men to be at things like this and hear this message. Every once in a while I get somebody kind of just curious about why I have a lot of women on the show who talk about women in ministry. And I mentioned earlier, I'm a part of the team that's leading SheLeads here in Austin. And so every once in a while I kind of get this, like, why are you so into this? And I just think that in a selfish way, there is like 50% of the church that I could be receiving from that I'm not so much.
I love that.
And I need a word from the women in the church. And so just on a purely selfish level, I want the women in church around me to be empowered to lead, so that I can receive.
I love that. And then it's not about rights. It's not just about doing it because it's fair. It's doing it because we believe that women truly bring you something unique to the church. And I do believe that God has gifted certain men, not that men get an out if this is not their gift, but I've watched, my husband is one of them. Some of the guys on staff with me are also like this, that there are certain men who I feel are called to be champions for women, and they can speak to women in unique ways. They can also speak to other men in unique ways and open doors for that. And I love that you are coming from that perspective of trusting that women bring something to the church. And I remember on the flip side of the painful experience I mentioned at a Christian conference, I was at a different conference several years later, where it was just a really great way that they were talking about doing discipleship in new ways, and that it was more organic and relational and all this kind of stuff. And all the male lead pastors in the room were kind of freaking out a little bit and saying, like, but what about our programs? Like, we love what you're describing and we want to do that, but we don't know how to do that. And I just it was the first time ever that I wanted to stand on the table and be like, we've got this, like, we've been doing this all along. We're right here with you. And I had this metaphor in my mind of like those kinds of movies, like the Lord of the Rings movies or something, where like a small band of friends is fighting the enemy and they're almost overcome. And then right on the crest of the hill, their other friends that 3 scenes ago parted ways from them are coming over the hill, and they're coming to like join this effort. And just when the first crowd is, wearing out and out of energy, their friends come alongside and say, you're not alone, we're here with you, So that's a moment I think that is happening right now in the church. And I should say that it's been beautiful how the kind of healing that God is doing in my own life, to do with the caricatures that I've even had about being a woman that are unkind from the world, as he's healing those things in myself, which also is bringing healing to my relationships and my ministry, he is also healing my own image of the church, who is the bride of Christ. And I've come to calling her ecclesia because it sounds like a woman's name. And I just have this amazing image in my mind at all times of a woman who has been enslaved, the church, that has been used for things that she was not meant for, and for the purposes of others, and been made into a factory or a business. And yet she has not lost sight of her true purpose and identity, and she longs to be released, to just run free. And I have this image of ecclesia released from the shackles and running barefoot through the fields with her skirts flying and her hair free, and running back to her husband. And for me, I can't separate that from the healing I see God doing in his daughters. And so I believe that they're interwoven as we are finding healing in these relationships between men and women, as women are finding healing in their own selves, that, of course, what is the church without us? We are ecclesia. And we are being restored to our call. We are being restored to the Lord and our mission. And it's just such a beautiful vision. I just can't set it aside.
Well, Will, obviously, I usually tell people we'll have links to this on the show notes. But if you're on the show notes of this show, you're already on missioalliance.com or .org. So just go on over to missioalliance.org/SheLeads and get all the information about the summit. And also it looks like there's about 11 cities who are doing a regional venue. And like I said,
so there's 12 together if you count Pasadena, and there's a few more that are still in the works. And I think we still have time. If you want to be a host somewhere, wherever you are, we could still take another couple of regional venues if you're interested.
Okay, awesome. And I'll give a plug for the one here in Austin. If you are in Austin or the surrounding area, please sign up. You can register on the website.
Yep, it's going to be a great day. You don't want to miss out.
Yeah, I'm so excited for it. Mandy, I've wanted to talk with you for so long, so I'm so glad that you took time to come on the show.
Yeah, I'm so glad we could. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Remember, you can find all the show notes for this show and all shows at ShaneBlackshear.com. Oh, and hey, have you ever thought about starting your very own podcast? I bet you have. And I think you should do it. In fact, I've created a course just for you to teach you everything that I've learned over the last couple of years producing Seminary Dropout. So if you're interested in podcasting and want to learn how, go check out my course. You can go there by typing in podcastingforeveryone.org. And you can get a special discount by typing in the discount code Seminary Dropout, all one word. That'll give you 25% off. So go check it out. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay. Thanks to those that left ratings and reviews on iTunes this week. Remember, that keeps the show front and center. Also, remember, you can find me on Twitter at @beardonabike. That's @beardonabike. Also, I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/ShaneBlackshear123. And remember that Seminary Dropout is listener supported. You can visit supportseminarydropout.com and press Become a Patron. Remember, this music you're listening to right now is by D.L. Rossi. You can find him online on iTunes and at dlrossi.com. All right, thanks again for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Love you. Take care. I always seem to bring that, but